The 8 minutes Queen was told to just fill time, and what happened next made David Bowie stop packing his equipment. Just get these kids on stage to fill time. Nobody's going to remember them anyway. The organizers' dismissive words echoed off the backstage walls of Royal Albert Hall in November 1973. A silence fell over the cramped storage room where four young men stood holding instruments they'd carried on their own backs. What nobody knew was that in 8 minutes, David Bowie would stop packing his equipment and stand frozen watching from the wings. That Elton John would rush from his dressing room in disbelief. That Rod Stewart would shake his head, unable to process what he was witnessing. That the record labels who'd slammed doors in these four faces would form a line begging for signatures before the night ended. Today the world kneels before Queen. That night they were nameless and penniless fill-in trash. But in 8 minutes, a Zanzibar immigrant died and a rock god was born. This is the story of the greatest 8 minutes in music history and the revenge that still echoes 50 years later. November 1973. Queen wasn't remotely close to the massive force we know today. Four young men risen from the ashes of a failed band called Smile were fighting just to survive. Brian May, holding the famous guitar he'd built with his father from an old fireplace mantel, was trying to solve the universe's mysteries while his stomach growled. Freddie was selling second-hand clothes at Kensington Market, trying to scrape together enough pounds for dinner. Roger was drumming in pubs for drinks. John Deacon had nearly given up music entirely to pursue electrical engineering because at least engineers could eat. But you know what the real shock was? Every single record label in London had slammed doors in their faces. EMI said their music was too complex for radio. Decca claimed Freddie's vocals were uncommercial and suggested they find a different singer. Imagine that, telling Freddie Mercury to find another singer. One executive actually told them to their faces that opera and rock didn't mix and never would. Stick to one genre or starve, he'd said, laughing as security escorted them out. For one solid week, these four brilliant musicians ate nothing but beans and bread. Beans and bread. Every single day. Brian's father offered him money, but Brian refused it, too proud to admit the dream was costing more than he could afford. Roger sold his drum kit twice and bought it back with borrowed money. Freddie worked 18-hour days at that market stall, his elegant hands handling dirty clothes, while his mind composed symphonies he had no studio to record. They were choosing between their dream and their survival when the phone rang. A massive charity concert was being organized at Royal Albert Hall. Huge names: David Bowie, Elton John, Rod Stewart, the best of British rock. But Queen wasn't invited as artists. Oh no, they were invited as last-minute filler. A band had canceled and someone needed to plug the gap. Nobody wanted to pay them. Nobody wanted to rehearse with them. They were disposable fill material. The terms were brutally humiliating. 8 minutes. That's all they get. 8 minutes on stage before the real stars came out, before the audience was even properly seated, before the lights were fully up, before anyone cared. They'd go on when people were still finding their seats, still chatting, still treating the concert like a social event. Background noise, human wallpaper. Roger Taylor exploded with rage when he heard the offer. "They're treating us like beggars," he shouted, throwing the phone across the room. "Like we should be grateful for scraps from their table." Brian agreed it was insulting. John said nothing, which meant he thought it was worse than insulting. But Freddie, with that sharp, penetrating look he had, cut through the anger with ice-cold precision. "We'll use those 8 minutes so effectively that nobody will ever forget us," he said quietly. "They're giving us 8 minutes? We'll make it feel like 8 hours. We'll burn ourselves into their memories so deeply they'll see us when they close their eyes." The other three stared at him. Roger started to argue but stopped, because they all recognized that look. Freddie wasn't making empty promises. He was making a vow. And when Freddie Mercury made a vow, physics itself bent to accommodate it. Concert day arrived and Queen carried their own equipment through the service entrance like laborers. The dressing rooms assigned to the real stars were upstairs, spacious and warm with catering and champagne. Queen was given a storage room, not a dressing room, a literal storage room in the basement with boxes stacked against walls and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. No mirror, no chairs, no heat. They changed into their performance clothes standing between cleaning supplies and old stage props. In the corridor, they watched Elton John glide past in his spectacular costume, trailing assistants and admirers. David Bowie floated by with that legendary aura surrounding him like an atmosphere. These men were in the major leagues. Queen hadn't even been allowed onto the field. They could hear the crowd gathering above them. 2,800 people filling Royal Albert Hall. Important people, wealthy people, people who decided which artist mattered and which didn't. People who'd never heard Queen's name and wouldn't remember it 8 minutes from now. Freddie stood in that storage room pulling on his performance clothes and heard everything. Every dismissive comment, every indication that they were considered irrelevant. Roger was pacing like a caged animal. Brian kept adjusting his guitar even though it was already perfectly tuned. John sat completely still, which meant his anger was volcanic. But Freddie was transforming. You could actually see it happening. The shy Farouk Bulsara who sold clothes in markets was evaporating. Something bigger was taking his place. Something that didn't just want to perform. Something that wanted to conquer. Seconds before they were supposed to go on, Freddie heard it. The conversation that would fuel his revenge for the rest of his life. He was standing near the stage entrance when organizer Patricia Rothschild walked past with the evening's announcer. The announcer held his notes, squinting at them with distaste. What was the name again? Queen? Who are these people? His voice dripped with contempt. Patricia laughed, not kindly, dismissively. Nobody important, just have them fill a few minutes so we can get to the real money. The auction is what matters. These kids are just keeping seats warm. Freddie heard every word, every syllable of dismissal, every ounce of contempt. And something happened in that moment that the people who knew him said they could actually see. His spine straightened. His shoulders went back. His jaw set. The fear and uncertainty that had been visible moments before vanished completely. In its place came something that looked like fury, but moved like certainty. Roger later said it was the only time he'd ever seen Freddie look genuinely dangerous. Not theatrical, not performed, actually dangerous. Like a bomb that had just been armed and was counting down to detonation. Brian said Freddie's eyes changed, became harder, more focused, like he'd just declared war on the entire music industry and was about to fire the first shot. John, typically silent, said years later that he knew in that exact moment they were about to do something that would change everything. Because Freddie Mercury could survive criticism, could survive rejection, could survive poverty and hunger and closed doors. But being dismissed as nobody, being treated as disposable fill material, that was gasoline on a fire that would burn for 40 years. The announcer walked onto the Royal Albert Hall stage with zero enthusiasm. The crowd was still settling. Conversations continued. People were hanging coats, finding seats, greeting friends. The atmosphere was social, not performative. Nobody expected anything significant. The announcer barely glanced at his notes. Our next act, Queen. Smattering of polite applause, mostly silence. People weren't being rude. They just had no idea who Queen was and didn't particularly care. Freddie walked to the microphone. Roger settled behind his drums. Brian positioned his homemade guitar. John took his place on bass, and Freddie, looking out at 2,800 people who thought he was nobody, delivered the opening line that would echo through history. Good evening, we are Queen and we're here to shake you, not entertain you, not play for you. Shake you, the word choice was deliberate, a threat disguised as introduction. Then Brian May's handmade guitar erupted with a riff so powerful it actually rattled the Royal Albert Hall's famous chandeliers. People who'd been putting on coats stopped mid-motion. Conversations died mid-sentence. The technical crew preparing to dim lights for the next act froze with their hands on the controls, because the sound coming from that stage wasn't good. It was devastating. It was a 4-octave hurricane delivered by a man who'd been told his voice was uncommercial. It was guitar work so complex, it made professional musicians in the audience lean forward trying to understand how it was physically possible. It was drumming that felt like artillery. It was bass that moved through your chest like an earthquake. Freddie wasn't singing. He was commanding. Every gesture turned 2,800 strangers into a single organism that moved when he directed and breathed when he allowed. He wasn't performing for an audience. He was absorbing an audience, making them part of the instrument he was playing. But here's where the story gets truly shocking, because what was happening in the audience was remarkable. But what was happening backstage was history changing itself in real time. David Bowie had been packing his equipment, preparing to leave after his own set earlier in the evening. He heard something that made him stop. Stop completely. Roadies said he actually froze with a guitar case half closed and just stared toward the stage. Then he walked through backstage corridors toward the wings, stood there watching this unknown band that he'd never heard of absolutely demolish every assumption about what live performance could be. Elton John had been in his dressing room reviewing auction items he planned to bid on. He heard the roar from the crowd. Not polite appreciation, actual roaring. He came out of his room confused because the roaring wasn't supposed to happen yet. The real stars hadn't performed. He made his way to the wings and stood next to Bowie, both of them watching in disbelief. Rod Stewart was backstage smoking, half listening to the show, when the sound quality changed so dramatically he actually put out his cigarette and went to investigate. Found Bowie and Elton already there. The three of them, titans of British rock, stood in the wings watching four kids they'd never heard of set the stage on fire with talent so undeniable it made experience feel inadequate. Music journalists who'd been chatting in the press area stopped talking and started taking notes. Record executives who'd been networking in the lobby moved toward the auditorium doors. The auction organizers who'd dismissed Queen as time filler stood frozen, realizing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades. And in that storage room basement dressing area, the EMI executive who'd said their music was too complex for radio was standing in the hallway listening. His face had gone pale because he was hearing his biggest mistake being broadcast to 2,800 witnesses and three legendary musicians who would never let him forget it. The 8 minutes felt like 8 hours because Freddie made every second count. Every note was precision warfare. Every gesture was calculated conquest. Every moment was designed to burn into memory so deeply it would still be smoking 50 years later. He wasn't just performing songs. He was delivering a dissertation on why dismissing him had been the worst decision these people would ever make. Brian's guitar solo lasted maybe 45 seconds, but people in the audience said it felt like time had stopped. Roger's drumming was so powerful, the venue's structural engineers later joked about checking the building's foundation. John's bass created frequencies that made champagne glasses on tables vibrate. And Freddie's voice, that voice that Decca had called uncommercial, that voice that executives said needed to be replaced, that voice filled Royal Albert Hall so completely that people in the back rows said they felt it in their chests, felt it in their bones, felt like Freddie Mercury wasn't singing to them but through them. When the 8 minutes ended, the response wasn't applause, it was detonation. 2,800 people who'd been casually chatting 8 minutes ago were now on their feet screaming. Screaming, not clapping politely, not showing appreciation. Losing their minds. The standing ovation lasted so long that the stage manager tried to bring the lights down and couldn't because the audience refused to stop, refused to sit, refused to let the moment end. They'd come to see Bowie and Elton and Rod Stewart, and those legends were in the wings applauding harder than anyone. Freddie walked off that stage drenched in sweat and vindication, walked back toward that storage room expecting to change and leave and collect the memories as payment, since actual payment hadn't been offered. But the hallway wasn't empty. The hallway was packed. EMI's executive was there, the one who'd said they were too complex, standing there with a contract in his shaking hands. Decca's representative was there, the one who'd suggested replacing Freddie, looking sick. Music journalists were pushing forward with notebooks and questions. Who are you? Where did you come from? When can we interview you? When's your next show? And behind them all, Patricia Rothschild, the organizer who'd called them nobody important and just filling time. She was crying, actually crying, trying to apologize, trying to explain she hadn't known, hadn't understood. Freddie looked at her with those dark eyes that had just commanded 2,800 people, looked at her for a long moment while she stammered, then spoke 5 words that everyone present would remember forever. Now you know who's important. Turned his back, walked into that storage room, closed the door, left her standing in the hallway with her apology stuck in her throat and her contempt turned to ashes. The auction that was supposed to be the night's real attraction became irrelevant. Nobody cared anymore. All anyone wanted to talk about was Queen. Who were they? Where could you see them again? How had nobody signed them? The record executives who'd been networking about established acts were now standing in a literal line outside Queen's storage room. A line. Like they were waiting for concert tickets, each one trying to be first to offer a deal, each one pretending they'd always believed in Queen's potential, each one hoping the band had forgotten their previous rejection. Brian May opened the door and saw them, saw the EMI executive who'd called them too complex, the Decca representative who'd suggested replacing Freddie, the executives who'd laughed them out of offices now standing humbly in a basement hallway waiting for permission to enter a storage room. He turned to Freddie. Should we make them wait? Freddie smiled, that particular smile that wasn't kind or cruel but simply aware of the full scope of what had just happened. Let them wait, he said. We have 8 minutes that just became infinity. They have careers that just became very small. The revenge was total and perfect and absolutely earned. Every record label that rejected Queen now fought to sign them. Every executive who dismissed their complexity now praised their innovation. Every venue that denied them stage time now begged them to perform. And Patricia Rothschild, the organizer who'd called them time filler, she spent the rest of her career trying to claim she'd discovered Queen, trying to rewrite history, but everyone who was there remembered her calling them nobodies, remembered the contempt, remembered Freddie's 5-word response that destroyed her. EMI signed in Queen within weeks, the same EMI that had called them too complex, offered them a multi-album deal with creative control. Because everyone in that building had heard what happened when you dismissed Freddie Mercury's vision. The Too Complex for Radio band went on to create Bohemian Rhapsody, which stayed at #1 for 9 weeks and became one of the most played songs in history. The voice Decca wanted to replace became the voice that defined a generation. This is what happens when you tell Freddie Mercury he's nobody. Royal Albert Hall, November 1973. 4 young men carrying their own equipment, given 8 minutes to fill time, treated like disposable background noise. And they used those 8 minutes to prove that the real stars were the ones the industry had been too blind to see. Freddie Mercury was told to fill time. Instead, he filled history, was called nobody, became immortal, given 8 minutes, made them eternal.